No problem. Try and speak clearly.
Before we take the interview, can we ask you about some working experience and your background on the building survey?
About, you want to know
about your
just
experience?
mine?
Yeah.
Right, so I think, can I remember the year? I think it may be 1989, probably. I was first a building surveyor. So, or maybe even, no, it's longer than that. I was a cadet building surveyor in 1986.
Wow.
So I had a year at a regional country council, Malala District Council, and I had 12 years at Salisbury Council as a building surveyor and health surveyor, and then another 12 years at Playford Council as a building surveyor, senior building surveyor and team leader, a year with a private certifier, and then here.
Okay.
Yeah. So the BCA came in while I was working at first, because it came in 1993.
Yeah.
And I remember taking this big thing away from the office, trying to understand its structure, because it was so different to what we'd worked with before with building acts and regulations. And it was also the first time I ever used a mouse in my life, because they provided this I guess an application of sorts. It was the first time we sort of used that in terms of a virtual volume, which is of course what it is now, which we just use all the time.
Okay.
So changes in building statutes, and then the building code, and then of course getting your head around performance solutions and all that. So, and of course when the BCA first came in, it changed every year for many years. Now it's a 3-yearly change, which is interesting. Oh, it's great. It's great because it saves us. I'm sure it saves millions of dollars in everybody getting up to date and so forth. And then it being freely available, publicly available document, was a major step forward for us. And it's just probably about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer now, that it's a public available document.
Okay. So can we get through the interview?
Sure.
And from the access and egress part, are you satisfied with the existing NCC provisions for the design of access and egress? And if not, why not?
Well, my first response when I first saw this question was no, and it was because of the second question. It's because we work really hard to make access available for people with disabilities, or equitable for all people, but it was too hard to think about people exiting a building. And so when I first started teaching 10 years ago, I used to say, we have a real problem here because it's not equitable, and we really want an equitable society for all people. And so about 3 years ago, we started to make some changes to egress for disabled people. We started thinking about thresholds on exits, whereas before we only wanted accessible thresholds for a certain amount of exits so that we could get people into buildings. But now we think about, well, if it is a required fire exit, then it should have a threshold that we can step down or roll down, whatever. So we made changes to that, to door hardware, and we started thinking about evacuation or emergency lifts. And whilst they're not really provided to for disabled people to egress, they begin to explore that area in terms of, fire brigades might use emergency lifts to evacuate people who need assistance. So we're beginning to consider how we might start legislating. Well, that's a further question anyway, isn't it? So yeah, it's not satisfactory because we're parking disabled people in stairways and so forth, and if I was a disabled person and everybody else is rushing past me to egress in an emergency, I would not feel equitably treated, and that's not what we want for our society. So when I also tried to consider the rest of the requirements that we have for provisions for access and egress, and I think we have worked very hard on access, and I think it's probably quite, I would say I'm satisfied with that. And with egress, we've been working with the deemed to satisfy provisions for egress for a really long time. We know them fairly well, they work fairly well, and we have lots of areas where we can vary that within performance, and I think the performance requirements are quite workable and clear. It's not one of the areas where we're really having problems with performance. Egress is fairly clear, and we have good systems to think about performance for egress anyway. So the rest of the provisions, I think you work with what you got, and they're fairly clear requirements.
Okay. So how do you think this will be dealt with in the future?
In the future, in a perfect world, we'll have the same arrangements for all people, and the disabled provisions won't look any different to what everybody else is doing. So every bathroom will be, usable by a disabled person, or there won't be separate places for them to go and separate things for them to do. They'll just have the same life as everybody else. And a few terms that we use to describe that are universal design, and I think there are some other designs of people who don't like that word. So universal design will be the way of the future eventually. But mostly it's the existing stock that we have a problem with converting that across, as we know.
Okay. Other than this, how do you think the NCC access and the egress provisions might develop in the future?
Well, I guess you could say that the other consideration then is how we do deal with existing buildings, because if we want a sustainable world, then it's no good knocking down buildings that we can't use anymore. So we really want to be able to reuse our existing building stock, because there's a certain amount of energy and cost in demolishing and rebuilding them, and in disposing of the demolished materials and then replacing them with new materials, with the embodied energy that is in the creation of a building, let alone its materials. So we need to find ways that we can adapt existing buildings that creates fair and equitable egress.
Okay. And for the energy and efficiency part, can you given the increasing reliance on renewable energy, do you think the NCC energy efficiency provisions are felt in every state, especially in South Australia and Tasmania?
Does this question, is it focused on where we can leverage off of the renewable energy used, or does it have to do with the difference in states as far as climate zones? What difference in states are you referring to? What's different about South Australia and Tasmania that you put that in the question?
Actually, I don't know, because this is another one's question and he's not coming. So
okay. So I guess there are a couple of things there. So the first thing is we want to promote the use of renewable energy, and I don't believe there's a difference in that between South Australia and Tasmania and the rest of the states. I guess South Australia has looked a bit closer at the performance requirements for energy efficiency, and there are two main parts to the performance requirements. One is that we have systems within a building that can mitigate the use of energy, and the second part is that we use services that use renewable energy, and I don't believe that's any different between South Australia, Tasmania and the rest of the state, so I'm not sure about that question. But the second part of the question is it fair if we're talking about, as I say, climate zones and deemed to satisfy provisions? I think that the climate zone considerations are absolutely appropriate and required for the country as big as ours with so many different climate zones, climate considerations. Okay. So I think it's fair. Yeah, it's complex, but I think it's fair. Certainly we're working with it. Yeah.
And which aspect of the NCC, if energy efficiency provisions is the most important, and why?
I guess if you looked to look to the future and think about what aspect we should be concentrating on to make further improvements, because we're always looking for that next step, especially in energy efficiency. Then what can we start to roll out next that will improve what we're doing already? Would be everything that's in Volume 1. What we can do, we've required the use of devices that allow us to turn off and on lights and other power sources, but we haven't mandated for their application. So whilst we need to be able to switch off a lot of external lighting for a building, for instance, nobody's saying that it needs to be switched off. So that might be the next step. Whether that actually belongs in the NCC or whether it belongs in some other mandate or statute, I'm not sure. But I think if you thought about what had the most potential for further consideration, it would be all the Volume 1 Part J requirements, and especially around lighting. I think that's an area it's been set up for something that we can work on later. We just haven't gone that next step yet. Yeah, so lighting, artificial lighting in Class 2 to 9 buildings.
Okay. Do you think the greenhouse gas emission caused by the buildings have declined since the NCC energy efficiency provision were introduced in Australia?
I think there's absolutely no doubt that our buildings are so much more energy efficient. Even if you go the most basic consideration, which was the upgrade of the building fabric. So the first provisions that we brought in were around insulating dwellings. That's where we went first, to stop people's reliance on air conditioning. And I've personally lived in modern homes and older homes, and I know that the difference between energy efficiency and the amount of times you need to turn on the air conditioner or heater is really noticeable. So I think I would say that is evidence that we have less reliance on greenhouse gases or electricity generally. What was my other thought on that? Was that when we brought in energy efficiency for buildings, we said it's not the greatest user of energy, but it's the fastest growing sector for the use of energy. So, as we expand our building stock, whether it be commercial buildings or residential buildings, we're just growing logarithmically in terms of what we're building. If we can start to think about reducing energy efficiency in our new buildings, then we can start to make a difference. So whilst you might not be able to prove that there was a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions due to use of energy in buildings, that wasn't really the aim. So while it hasn't declined, our reliance on it in relative to the strength is less than it would have been if we hadn't done anything back then, which was I don't know. Trying to think what year that was. Maybe early 2000s that we first started talking about energy efficiency in buildings.
Yeah.
Might have been earlier than that. When I talk about the BCA, I'm always saying to students, about 3 years ago, and when they look it up, it's about 7 years. Yes.
Okay. Fire resistance code. After 2014 Lacrosse fire Melbourne and the 2017 Grenfell fire in London, the APCP changed in the NCC 2016 Volume 1 in 2018. The change clause C1.9 required that buildings of type A or B construction must be constructed within non-compressible cladding. The Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal found the building certified involved in the Lacrosse tower construction by partly responsibility by the fire. Has that changed the way private certifier and building surveyors makes assessments?
Definitely. The BCA always said that in type A and B buildings, combustible cladding was not was prohibited in external walls. So we made some changes, but they really were clarifications and a few other things that made sense. But the basic rule about non-combustible cladding in Type A and B construction was always there. So, which really leads to the next question is that where did it go wrong? It's potentially a lack of good specification of materials in documents, and that's the private certifier and building surveyor's job to ensure that the documents are, or that the specifications within the documents are compliant with the NCC and that they are constructed. So better specification which would be demanded by the private certifier and building surveyor. So that's definitely a change in how they make assessments in specification. But further to that, making sure that during the construction that variations aren't made that allow the wrong materials to be used, because quite often there may be a change between what's specified and what's constructed due to cost pressures and so forth. So that's step 2 of making sure that what's approved is built. And apart from that, I think if building surveyors and private certifiers weren't aware of the ACP problem and the extent of it and the different grades of ACP, they're certainly more aware now. So they're making better assessments in terms of that product specifically. But I think that it's also highlighted problems across the board in terms of specification, documentation and assessment, and that private certifiers and building surveyors who weren't doing really good documentation and paper control, which is required by the NCC specifically, are probably now doing a much better job of ensuring that they have good evidence of their decisions, and every reason for a decision should be documented at every stage. Like crazy.
Has there been a significant change in cladding system with the introduction of this change?
Definitely. Nobody's touching ACP in any way, shape or form at the moment. So, as you say, Type A and B buildings don't allow use of this product. But even Type C buildings and even structures that don't qualify as buildings, where this product might have been used before, you won't see this product. And even buildings that are not Type A and B, and where the combustible cladding is allowed, and if ACP is installed, they're even removing it from these structures. So there's been a massive change in building cladding systems. And I say to my friends when they ask me about fire engineering and combustible cladding, I say, you won't see those shiny, sexy, blingy buildings anymore. You'll see dull buildings with precast concrete which have that different finish, because that's what we'll have to get used to. We know those buildings are safer. So definitely that's another change, architecturally speaking.
Fire protected timber was adopted in NCC 2016 Volume 1. This allows multi-story buildings up to 25 meter in effective height to be constructed using fire protected timber. What has been the reception of the provision by the construction industry?
I don't have a lot of experience in what this might have looked like in the last 3 years that this has been around, but I do think it's driven very much by the timber lobby. So suppliers of timber are talking to specific developers and builders who are in that area, perhaps class 2 and apartment buildings tend to be their focus at the moment. I guess it's a little bit of a niche area if it's not just apartment buildings and anything else that might be a bit inclined to be icon type building or something special, something an architect might have, some a building of interest so that you can use it as a showcase. So I haven't seen a lot of take up of this, and it's really, as I say, the timber lobby group. It's how much of their product they can sell, and they're up against the steel lobby group, who are also a very forceful lobby. So personally I wouldn't know, and it'd be up to how much they can sell of their product, really.
Service and equipment. NCC 2019 removed the requirements of fire hydrant poster protection for sprinkler protection building and added alternative protection for fire hydrant poster located between 3.5 meter and 10 meter from building type protect. In your opinion, why did the APCA make these changes?
So it's really a couple of different things. So firstly, we made some changes to sprinkler protection for these buildings, and we said that some buildings could now have less robust systems. So where we talk about commercial sprinkler systems having a particular hydraulic capacity and a particular flow and pressure, and what we said is that we can accept lesser systems for some buildings. So they're really using systems that are more like a residential sprinkler system with that less robust design. So this is the reason we've reduced some of the requirements for booster protection for some of those buildings, because it wouldn't be required to boost the pressure and flow of systems in sprinkler buildings. And then the second part of the question is the protection for boosters. So I looked this up to remind myself what the actual standard said. Oh, I looked it up here. We have the performance requirements and performance solutions that are allowed by the BCA, and when we get a lot of use of the same performance requirement, something's commonly used as a performance requirement, then the ABCB might consider whether it's appropriate to write it in to the deemed to satisfy provisions. So if it's commonly done and it's just a common solution that's been brought into the deemed to satisfy framework.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. For class 2 and 3 buildings, NCC 2019 requires buildings in these classes over 4 stories and under 25 meter effective height to have sprinkler protection system. In your opinion, was there a need for this provision, and will this provide more protection?
Yeah. So this goes back to what I was just saying. A proposal for change to the BCA can be made by anybody, and if it meets certain requirements, a bit like the performance solution coming into the deemed to satisfy, then the ABCB will consider it, the Australian Building Code, the board. So a proposal for change needs to prove that the cost of a new requirement such as this is outweighed by the benefit to society. And so a lobby group like the fire brigades across the country have lobbied the Australian Building Codes board for this, and it means that buildings will be safer for the occupants, and really has an effect on the operations of the brigades as well. So they've lobbied for this change. They've been able to prove that it's worthwhile, that it will save lives, it makes buildings safer. And this is also part of the previous question. We've, in order to do this, we've had a close look at, the cost and so forth of commercial sprinkler systems in this situation, and said, well, we could actually achieve this with a different grade of sprinkler system. We brought in those other codes that describe those grades. So it's it also means that if there is a performance solution to be done in these types of buildings, then we're looking at the sprinkler system, that it's actually easier to create a performance solution that compares with this particular setup, with this. So if we have clearly set down guidelines for sprinkler protection in these buildings, and we want to vary that, it's easy to make that comparison with a standard design, almost a standard design, or a standard idea, or a standard set of requirements. Yeah. So yes, that's going to make some life-saving outcomes, and I guess you could wrap the combustible cladding into this question and say,
Yeah.
we know we have a risk out there now with combustible cladding. It's not going to happen in new buildings, the combination of the two, but it could be part of the the response to what do we do to remediate a building that has combustible cladding on it, to use some of these systems.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. How did you go with your other interview? What do we do to remediate a building that has combustible cladding on it, to use some of these systems?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. How did you go with your other interview?